James didn't pick up a musket. He didn't join a line of soldiers. He was stationed under the Marquis de Lafayette. And you've probably heard that name, especially if you've seen the Hamilton musical. The young French nobleman who'd come to fight for the American cause. And Lafayette, well, he had a different job for James. He had one that was much more sinister. He needed a spy, not just any spy. He needed someone who could walk into the British camp and convince them he was one of them. So here is the kind of insane part. Lafayette's plan was brutal in its simplicity. James would pose as a runaway slave. That's it. That's the entire cover. Nothing really to blow. He's a runaway slave. Now, think about that for just a second. An enslaved man walking into the camp of the army that represents the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. And he's pretending he's escaped from his enslaver. Well, the British, they'd seen runaway slaves before. It wasn't something that was that unusual, really. And here's what made it work. James was a native Virginian. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand. He knew the roads, he knew the rivers, and all the towns. And so to the British, a local runaway who could tell them about the countryside, this wasn't a threat. This was an asset. So what happened was the British, and specifically Benedict Arnold, yes, that Benedict Arnold, the guy who basically flipped sides, they welcomed him in and they gave him a job. They asked him, if you can believe this, to spy on the Americans. It's late summer 1781, and James sends a note to Lafayette. This note's going to change everything. He tells Lafayette that Cornwallis is moving his army from Portsmouth to a little tobacco port called Yorktown, and that 10,000 British troops are expected there. Now, if you watched any of this series, and I really hope you have, if not, I recommend you check it out, you know exactly what that word means and why it matters. Yorktown. That's because that's the place. That's the trap. Because what Lafayette does is he gets that intelligence and he sends it straight to George Washington. And Washington, he looks at this information and understands immediately. He sees the opening. Cornwallis has made a fatal mistake and is moving to a peninsula with water on 3 sides. Now, it's important to remember part 3. Benjamin Franklin, he's in Paris, and he convinced the French to send a ton of ships, an entire navy. And if you remember in part 1, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed into Chesapeake Bay and blocked the entrance. 28 massive ships of the line. The British relief showed up, saw those ships waiting, and they turned around. Everything in this series, the weapons, the spy ring, the French alliance, it all converges right here. And it converges because an enslaved man walked straight into an enemy camp and sent a note. That's why it works. So here's how it goes down. It's September 28th, 1781. The American and French forces arrive at Yorktown. Washington has marched his army south from New York in total secrecy. The French, under General Rochambeau, are with him. And de Grasse's fleet is holding the bay completely shut. Cornwallis is trapped. He has no escape by sea. There's no reinforcements coming, and there's no supplies. Washington's army from the north, Rochambeau's French troops, and de Grasse's fleet blocking the bay. Cornwallis's army is boxed in at Yorktown. And so by October 6th, the Allies start digging the first siege line. It's been raining and the ground is really soft, so the digging is quick and it's quiet. The line goes up in one night, October 9th. The artillery opens fire. And if you watched the part about the weapons, you know what's coming. Washington himself fires the first American gun around 5 a.m. in the morning. And for 11 straight days, the bombardment is relentless. It just doesn't stop. Solid shot was smashing through walls, mortar shells dropping straight down, and grape shot, the stuff I talked about in the weapons episode, well, grape shot was basically a bag packed with iron balls that turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. The British, they were not able to sleep. They can't reinforce their defenses. They can't even bury their dead. October 14th, and this is where part one comes back. Hamilton leads that bayonet charge, the famous bayonet charge against Redoubt number 10. And you know what? He did it with unloaded muskets, and he did it in the dark. 10 minutes, and the redoubt is taken. October 16th tries to escape. He moves his troops to the waterfront at midnight and starts ferrying them across the river to Gloucester Point. And then, well, a storm hits. A sudden, intense storm that forces him to abandon the evacuation. So let that sink in. This man and his troops are trapped by geography. They're trapped by the French fleet, trapped by the siege that's going on, and now he's trapped by the weather. His troops are eating rancid meat and wormy biscuits. Smallpox is broken out, and Clinton, the British commander in New York, says he'll arrive in 2 to 3 weeks. But Cornwallis, he knows. He's not coming. October 17th, a British drummer boy appears on the ramparts beating a signal that, because of the amount of shelling that was going on, nobody could hear it. There was just too much cannon fire. Then a British officer comes out waving a white handkerchief. And the guns, well, the guns finally fell silent. October 19th, the British garrison, it marches to Surrender Field and lays down its arms. 1/3 of all British forces in North America, that's a massive amount. 1/3 of all British forces gone in one fleeting stroke. And here's the thing that nobody really talks about. The war ends. America celebrates. Of course they do. Freedom rings across the land, and James Armistead, he goes back home. But he goes back home to slavery. He went back to being owned by another human being. The country he just helped create, the country he risked his life for, it didn't free him. There was a Virginia law in 1783 that freed enslaved men who'd fought in the war. But here's the rub. James wasn't a soldier. He was a spy. And his service, well, they said it didn't qualify. The Marquis de Lafayette, the man who'd sent James into the British camp in the first place, actually wrote a letter to Congress on James's behalf. And here's what he wrote. This is to certify that the bearer has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligence from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and most faithfully delivered. Now, that's a pretty powerful letter. I love the line, industriously collected and most faithfully delivered. That's Lafayette. Now, consider a French nobleman writing to the American government, vouching for a man the American government wouldn't even recognize as a citizen. Well, the cool part about this story is it worked. In 1787, James Armistead became a free man. He added the name Lafayette to his name. So it was James Armistead Lafayette. And he moved to his own 40-acre farm in Virginia. He got married. He raised a family. He lived as a free man. And here's this cool part. And this really got to me. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette returns to the United States on a grand tour. Lafayette, he's a hero. There's crowds everywhere. And at some public event, Lafayette looks into the crowd, and guess who he sees? He sees James. He easily picks him out, and he walks over and embraces him. So nearly 40 years after the war, an old French general and an old American spy standing in a crowd hugging each other. And the thing is, nobody knew who James was. So let me bring this all together because this is the finale and it deserves a proper send-off. This series, well, it started with the Culper spy ring, a group of ordinary people that set out signals to make sure that Washington had the information that he needed. Then we talked about the weapons the weapons, the musket, the bayonet, the cannons, the ships, all of that. And then we told a story of a 70-year-old man in a fur cap and a brown coat who convinced a king to bet on a losing war. But the person who tied all of this together, the weapons, the intelligence, the French alliance, was a man who was initially not set free. A man who walked into an enemy's camp because a young French general asked him to. A man who sent a note that changed the course of the war for both sides. And a man who then had to fight for his own freedom after he'd won everyone else's. James Armistead Lafayette. Remember that name. If you've enjoyed this series, and I really hope you have, I've put a lot of time and effort into it, hit subscribe for me. And you can get more untold stories. We do history every week here on Archives and Anchovies, the podcast about whatever it is I want to talk about that week. And if you missed parts 1, 2, or 3, they're all linked right here. And as always, I want to wish you a great day, a pleasant evening, and a wonderful week ahead. Thank you.